Okay, here's the famous red egg demo. So it's a great way to start a basic uh, course in reflective rendering is to, I'm just going to redo this for you. And again, I will give you this layered file as well. First thing you want to do is create your environment. So I am going to create the environment by just filling a layer, and then I'm going to put a little gradation down the back wall of that using the gradient tool. That works, something like that. And then I'm going to lighten up the ground plane a little bit below our object. I'm going to put that on a separate layer so I have a little bit more control. I'm going to set to that, and I'm going to pick this color and value. So we're basically defining a horizontal, a flat ground plane, and a vertical wall. It's gone through like the same sort of curve that we had on that setup that we observed for the sphere. And that's our photo stage. And maybe I'll leave that on a separate layer so I can mess around with it a little bit. Okay, the next thing I need is I want to create my object. So I'm going to make a new path layer. I'm going to come over here to the shape tool. Sorry. There we go. The ellipse tool. And I'm going to drag out this floating egg. And I just set that to pixel, so it just fills automatically, but with a nice controlled super sharp edge. Okay, now I want to put a layer underneath that for the shadow. The really quick and dirty way to do the shadow is just grab your, oops, sorry, I put my sphere on the same layer as my ground plane. So let's back that up a bit. Sorry, new layer, my bad. And shape tool again, draw out our egg, there we go. And now it's on its separate layer. Okay, and I'm just make mine floating above this surface. All right, pretty good. Now what I was saying, quick and dirty way to make a shadow, just copy that layer, squeeze it down. We're seeing a little bit of the ground plane, so let's drop it down here. And let's see, we're going to be using a soft light box, so actually the shadow in this case is going to get a little bit smaller than the object because we have a little bit of leakage, right, of the light. If the light's bigger than the object or it's very diffused, it's going to wrap around a little bit. And I'm going to just go to levels and I'm going to darken that shadow down. Now if this is a matte surface, a nice way to do that is the halfway to black trick to check the values. So if that's the lightest value out here, I want my cast shadow to be halfway, right about there. So let's see where we are. Looks good enough, pretty close. So I'm going to leave it, and then I'm going to blur it a little bit because your shadow edge needs to be consistent with the type of light that it's coming from. And in this case, I have this overhead light box that I'm going to be using, which is just a big, photographic light box that is used for nice photo shoots. And I'm going to squeeze that down a little bit less perspective, something like that. All right, so floating below the egg is my cast shadow, and nice soft edge because I have a soft diffused light above. Now, first thing to do is the matte surface shading. Actually, let's put my egg above the shadow. There we go. Now, to render and shade where I already have pixels, you just go to the Preserve Transparency button, turn that on, grab a nice airbrush, and like I said, I'll give you some of these airbrushes. Again, I'm going to use halfway to black, so that will be my core shadow value. And I'm going to, and the light's like directly above. So first I'm going to darken down this whole shadow side a little bit, and then I would like to intensify the core shadow, leaving a little bit of reflected light from below. And maybe we'll stretch that up a little bit. Should be the lightest right on the very top because that's perpendicular to the direction of the light, which, don't get confused, that has nothing to do with its reflectivity. This is a straight matte surface. So if I moved around this egg and I walked around it, this gradation, this value map would stay the same. I might intensify that a little bit. A nice way when you're working in Photoshop, if you've got your gradations the way you like them, right, you can just do a little levels adjustment. And so if it was white up on top, and I would expect the core shadow to be about a 5, which is halfway to black. So you could actually go, so that's the value scale for everything on here. I could say, we'll put that at white, put the core shadow at 5. It's nice to use that. You've got straight, numbers now, 0 to 5, and some nice reflected light. Okay, we probably have a little less reflected light directly below, so get a little more accurate here. We probably should knock this down a little bit right here because we're not getting reflected light out of the shadow, and that's directly below the shape, so we get something happening about like that. Okay, matte surface is done. I'm going to save that as a white one, and in fact I'm going to save this all together, and I'll leave these new layers, and I'll leave you also my older layers to compare. So we have a couple different examples to look at. And I'm going to do now a levels adjustment because I want to try and do the famous red egg here. So right now it's a nice map for white with our levels. So instead of 0 to 5, really white, I really want the light side of white, if it's going to be red, I'm sorry, to be about a value 5. So if I darken it down to about a value 5, that means the top here, right? This is the light end, this is the dark end of the value scale. This is a highlights, midtones, shadows. So if I want to take the white and turn it into a value 5, slide it down to the middle. Now my white is a value 5 at the top. Then what about my midtones? Well, my midtones, right, which are here, okay, have to get a tick darker because I don't want those to stay. Well, it might be good enough, but we can double check it after. Let's go here. Let's double check it. Say, okay, up in the light, I want that. I want the core shadow to be halfway to black. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Good enough. In an indoor studio, which is what this is, right? And that's what our first couple of weeks of rendering are going to be, is rendering indoor studio setups. Then we're going to move to the outdoor environment. You can definitely get that to be totally black in an indoor studio. Let's get rid of the white one behind there. If you wanted to, because your entire environment around is black. The halfway to black idea is really what you see happening in nature with a nice clear blue sky, and with the ambient skylight filling in the shadow side, you get that sort of mapping. So you can definitely push it more extreme in the studio setup if you like. So I'm going to colorize that. So Command U brings up the hue and saturation. I'm going to colorize and turn up the saturation a bit to nice saturated red. Okay. Now, really what we have to do is now reflect our environment into our egg. So I'm going to get a layer on top, which is going to be my clear coat. And since it's going to be, I'm going to render it first so that it's chrome, and then I'm just going to erase it. What I actually could do is, let's see, I could load a selection, would be one way. If I hold down the command key and click on the red egg below, it will load that selection. I could go back to my path. If I saved my path, I didn't in this case. Or another way I could do it, there's always multiple ways to do things in Photoshop. So I'm going to kill that. I could just double this. Okay. Oops, sorry. So I have it on top, and I could just change it to the color of the background. So let's just re-render it. So let's go airbrush 100. I'm just going to pick the value and color of the background. It's set to preserve transparency, and I'm just going to get rid of the red. Okay, now let's think about our environment. Our environment gets darker up to the top. All right, so I could say pick somewhere up in there. Oops, My airbrush is still set to 100%. I like to use something that's a little bit softer, a little lower opacity. Okay, so that, as it rolls to the background, okay, it's going to ultimately reflect the same color and value that's surrounding it. So you can sort of just go around and pick the color and value that's around your object to render the chrome on top. And then here we have the ground plane. I'm going to not worry about the shadow yet. Okay, so right back here, it's going to reflect something like that. Right out here, probably about halfway down from the center to the bottom would be about a 45-degree surface. That would point our line of sight straight down. It's probably the brightest bright in this scene is straight below the egg. So it's better to probably start with the center and work your way out. So now I've got to just go back to the edge here to get the silhouette. And I just pick what's directly behind it, right? Get up closer to the edge, just picking. So this part's reflecting down to the ground, and then up top, we don't really know what's up above out of frame here, so you can take some artistic license, and if you want to make it even darker, you could say, well, up above, overhead, there's no seams in this environment. Okay, we could put some in if we like, but if we just wanted to say it was a smooth wall, smooth environment, smooth gradations, right, that's kind of what we could assume. This is where my line of sight bounces upward, right? And just for a little quick schematic review of that, let's look at that. I'm assuming that my egg has got a circular cross section. See if I can draw a cleaner circle. And then here's the ground plane. Okay, here we are, our eyeball, and we look into that surface, bounces back towards us. We look here, bounces up. We look there, bounces down. And one thing I want to highlight, where's the shadow? Well, the shadow is pretty much straight below, so this would be the shadow. Just maybe make that a different color so we can see it. Shadow. Okay. So the question is, where is the shadow going to reflect into the side of the sphere? Well, if I measure my angles right, it looks like it's about halfway between here and the bottom, right? When I'm looking at the bottom of this. So from here, if that's halfway, probably right about there. And then the back of the shadow, let's see, if I look here and it bounces off at the same angle, looks like my sphere is my egg's a little higher than this proportionally. So I would say that right here it's going to bounce behind, back down to the ground, but probably right about there would bounce straight down and see if my shadow was a little bit lower, the back edge. So it means from here to here. But it means that right at the very edge, it doesn't go all the way to the back. So basically when I look straight down, this is going to be the width of the reflection of my shadow. Okay, and then if my light was overhead, and my light box was, let's say, from here to here, I have to do that over, sorry. My light's going to be up here somewhere, much, much higher. So line of sight comes along, we know it bounces straight up somewhere around in there. So if the front edge is just a little bit in front of my object, that means if that's center, that's halfway. So right about here is where the front edge of my light box is going to be. And what about the back edge? Well, line of sight bounces along probably somewhere in there. It's definitely not on top. It's not like a matte surface, because if it's on top, my line of sight's going to bounce behind it. So it's probably here. Now you can take a lot of artistic license with this because we can't see it. So you really can't be wrong. And I'm going to make those curve this way, positive, so it's more like a section line bending across the surface. If I made it go this way, it wouldn't really help the form to read. So, and this, you know, to be honest, my light box overhead, the left and right edge could be any shape, right? We can't see it. Could be a bright, you know, cut out piece of paper with light shining up on it instead of like a skylight or something. So I think I'll make that my skylight. What about my shadow? Well, remember I was talking about on the spheres, draw perpendicular to the silhouette. If I draw a line perpendicular to the silhouette, and I know my surface is circular, that on this, so if I can find a line here that's perpendicular and points at the end of my shadow, okay, the shadow end is going to be somewhere on that line, somewhere on this line, somewhere on this line. I know I got the width of it from here, so that was there to there, and I know that it's elliptical. So now I can try and sketch that warped, right? Probably the middle and the middle or somewhere over in there. So it's going to curve a little bit faster. And then it's got to straighten back out a little bit. So there, and roughly like that. That's the reflection of my cast shadow. See, it's deceptive, right? The cast shadow, if it's straight down, you wouldn't think it's going to be all the way up in here, but that's really a nice 45-degree angle, and that's equal in, equal out, point straight down. That's the front edge of my shadow. So that, if I had a little ball on the ground right here, that's where it would be. That's where it would be. Okay, how do we make those? So now we need to finish our rendering, basically. So we've got the reflection of the shadow, reflection of the light. I'll put the reflection of the light probably on a separate layer and then cut it out from our background, from our clear coat. Okay, so I'm going to take the shadow, I'm going to duplicate it, I'm going to float it. Sorry, when I push hard with my pen, that sometimes pops up, thinking I want to do more than just grab the layer. And I'm going to stretch it up into here, and I'm going to shorten it and shorten it a bit, and then I'm just going to go over here and I'm going to warp it. Now it's a nice soft shadow, right? So you want all that fuzziness to stay there. Okay, and let's see about, yeah, that's roughly in the right spot. It's good enough. And also, probably when I stretched it, the value got a bit worked over there, so I maybe need to darken it up a little bit. So let's just go here. That gets us pretty close. And you can always refine the shape if you like, but that's pretty close to where the reflection would be expected. Let's go back here, and I'm going to open up my path layer, and this time I will draw a path. And so I'm going to use the path tool. I'm looking at my sketch. Because it's a path, we can refine it after. Okay, and let's go to the white arrow, the direct selection tool. Click on that guy, and let's tweak these handles a little bit. Make my reflection a little bit more refined. Something about like that will probably work. Okay, now this curve right here should probably be a little bit straighter because it's down near the center. So there's less influence of the curve of the silhouette. Okay, but again, your light overhead could be a bending light. It doesn't have to be a straight line. We can't see it, so there you have a lot of artistic license. Okay, that works. I'm going to put that on a separate layer, and I'm going to hit this button here. That'll just fill it with whatever's the current foreground color. That's fine. I'll just hit preserve transparency on that. I could have picked white before, so now you pick the color of your light. I'm just going to use a white light, and I will grab a hard edge brush, or you could use paint bucket. Okay, fill that in. Let's get rid of my schematic. All right, so that's my overhead light reflecting the shadow. And you know, it might be a little bit low, but it works. It's fine. If the light gets further away, or if it's, maybe it's just a little bit too fat for my taste. A little bit like that, a little bit thinner. Okay, now I'm going to take this and I'm going to load this selection, which is my reflection. I'm going to go to my reflection layer, turn off preserve transparency before you delete, and I'm going to delete that out. Now the reason for that, right, is that they're on the same reflection layer, the same clear coat, so you don't want them to overlap. So get rid of the overlapping by turning off your, by deleting it out. You can take the cast shadow and this guy, the reflection layer, your clear coat, and you can merge those together, right? Those should all be together. This is also together, the light box, but I like to keep that separate because it's so much brighter. A lot of times you want separate control of that, like we did with the spotlight earlier on the sphere. Okay, so that's pretty close. So now what we need to do is, let's leave that off for now, and add a layer mask as my way to erase the clear coat. So I'm just going to grab an airbrush like so, and I'm going to say wherever my line of sight is perpendicular, and maybe even give myself a little bit more help by squeezing this guy into the same degree of my shape. That's pretty close. Then when I erase, probably getting something sort of a little bit more accurate, kind of for free. So I'm sort of letting it, I want to let it become chrome out at the silhouette. And by having that turned off, my overhead reflection there of the light, I can actually see how much I still have left. It's kind of nice. Okay, because I like to just let it reflect just a little bit. Okay, so there it is reflecting. And that's because of the Fresnel effect, which is our theme for this week. There's my overhead light box. Now, what you want to do with the light box is you also want to put a gradation into it using a layer mask, because we want to trick your brain into seeing a form change. So if I introduce a gradation in this by erasing the back edge, now this could be for all sorts of reasons, right? This could be because there's a gradation in the light itself. It could be a skylight that's only being lit on one side. So I'm doing kind of the opposite of what you would have, what I erased, right? I'm leaving this more opaque at the front and letting it get, more transparent at the back. The reason for that is that the gradation could actually be in my light itself. So you have, again, a lot of artistic license because we can't see it. You could also start to do things like, let's say it really was an overhead skylight. I could actually have a couple of classic, window beams, right, cutting through my overhead light. It's not very nice construction there. The beam's not very straight. Let's see if I get lucky. Now it's wobbly, but you get the idea. So it's overhead window. That's the lights shining through. So that's one of the classic looking, cliche. They're cliches, but I actually have like three of them in my studio here, so they look exactly like that. There's a little bit more going on because there's other shapes and forms in there, and if that's just time. Okay, now we have our gradation. Now you can start to change how shiny versus how red. So this would be the case if it was a glossy egg, and I'm going to even crunch it down a bit here and increase the contrast, pushing that core shadow even stronger so it shows through a little bit more. Again, it's our indoor lighting setup. We can do that. And the question is, how much do you want it to look like chrome? You can double that up. There, it's becoming much shinier, right? Becoming its environment. If you went too far with this, you can always double that up. Okay, that's basically basically what happens. I think I like the shinier one, so maybe I'll leave those two, and maybe this is a little too much. Okay, now one of the ways to really make things start to look more real is to have elements that get covered. So for instance, let's do I'm going to add a new path, and I'm going to add a cut line. Let's just do something like this that cuts across our shape, like so. And I'm going to grab a little airbrush here. I think I've got a little cut line thing. 100%, it's a tiny little airbrush. Yes, I've got a separate layer. I'm going to put it on top of my reflections. And I'm going to stroke that path. Oops, don't want white. Technically, I want a really dark red. It's just going to be like a little design line cuts into that surface. Something like that. Unselect it. Let's see how I want to do this. I guess I could work it this way. I'm going to load that selection, and I'm going to reverse it and hit delete. And I just want to get rid of those little edges that were there. Now, if when we have a cut line like this, and it goes through the reflection, a nice way to make that look more real, in fact, let's leave it down below here. And let's go to let's kill our second reflection, just go back to our first one. And I'm going to basically erase that right through here, a little bit larger than the cut line itself because there's a little radius on there. And if you're really getting clever about it, you'd try to wrap this edge a little bit and then pull the other one. You'd get a lot of that kind of distortion wrapping if there was a big fat radius on there. Now the other way you make this thing look real, you can go to your cut line here as well. Okay, like that, reflecting the environment. Then what you can do, take your cut line, copy it, and I'm just going to drop it a little bit lower, like that, and maybe add a little bit of Gaussian blur, not much, just a tick. Okay, and hit preserve transparency, and then I'm going to pick my red. Okay, and I'm going to paint it so that it catches a little bit of light from overhead. And then what's happening here is it fades underneath. Okay, it wouldn't catch the light beyond probably right about this core shadow. So what you need to do is either erase that or paint it out. You could paint it out just by picking the same red as the egg and letting it get a little bit fatter there. My tendency would probably be to use a layer mask and go to black and paint that out. Just erase it, and then you can always bring it back. And it also looks to be a little bit too fat, so maybe I'll just move it up. Sorry, was not moving the right layer. And it's on top, not underneath. There we go. Looks pretty close. Now that's starting to make the reflection look transparent because it's covering something else. Another way you can do that, I'm not going to bother erasing that, it's the same as this, is if you have a graphic. So let's say I go in here and I've got some writing on this thing or some logo of some sort. It's fantastic, I know. Let's go here and command new layer via copy. And what I want to do now is change, let's first change the color. So command U, and let's change the hue of that, something like so. Okay, so my values are all still right, so it still wraps across the surface, and because I can see something going underneath the reflection, right, this starts to look more like a reflection versus a graphic. Okay, and you can see it's kind of endless. You can start to texture things, and this is still just glossy matte surface. We're not, I'm sorry, a glossy painted surface. We're not talking about metallics yet. I think I have one of my eggs here is metallic. But you can go ahead and look at that, but we're not going to cover that in detail for another week or so, or two. Okay, so looking at this egg, I think, oh, nice thing, of course, you can change color. Okay, the reflection of our environment is the same. You can change saturation. You can darken down. Say I would just put a black egg, right? Of course, I'd have to change my red highlight, but you get the idea. You can start to change all of that stuff, and all your reflection layers, all that stuff stays the same. So it's huge benefit for a production standpoint if you need to show color options to your client. So I think we'll call that one. I better save that one. And I think that's going to be it for this week. So this week, hang on, I'm just going to make one last little change before. I think I'm also going to take off the ends of this to get the curve working across as well. I was just looking at that and it was bothering me. So the ends of this are just too bright, too hot for me. So I want to knock those back a little bit. So again, just adjusting my layer mask. And also maybe this guy's a little too shiny. So knock that back a little bit as well, letting us see a little bit more of the egg underneath. There we go. It's a little bit better feel. Okay, save it. So this week for homework, check my list here. Render a glossy painted simple reflective form of your own design and collect useful photo reference of shiny objects in indoor studio environments. So that is your homework. I'd like to see one of these or multiples, experiment with it, try some different shapes, put some dimples on, put some domes on there, whatever you like. It's mostly about getting comfortable in Photoshop, trying to get the form to read without using the matte surface underneath. To that point, I think I will just demo one more time the cool little dimple rendering step. Let's do something like that. Okay. And I'm going to do, let's see, let's just do a Command-Shift-C, which just copy everything that it sees below. Command-Shift-V puts it on that layer. Okay, you can't see it because it's exactly what it saw below. I'm going to hit Preserve Transparency. I want it to be a little bit of a dimpled shape, so I'm going to pick this color and value for the leading edge, which is this section is much more like that section, and then this section is much more like the backside. So I just started adding form, and it had nothing to do with the direction of the light. It has everything to do with the strength of the reflection per the awesomeness of the Fresnel effect. And lastly, a little bit of a radius on there via a little Gaussian blur. And there we go. I just put a little dimple in our egg. Save that. I'll save it. I'll leave these layers off. Feel free to turn those on and off. Have a look at what's going on there. I'll save the schematics for you. It's just different egg above there. In fact, let me just put our rendering that we just went through today. Let's put all that in one group. There we go. So group one is going to be my demo. I should probably label it for you. SR demo. Okay. I'll leave these off, leave that one on, and you can expand that, and hopefully it helps. So have fun, design something interesting, but keep it simple. We're going to go more complex the week after that. So really just try and get familiar with all the layers. I will provide you with some basic tool presets. We didn't talk much about that, but this is one of my favorite ways to work, as you saw me working all of today's demo, which is getting the tools you use the most saved. So let's say I love to use this airbrush at 81% opacity and set to a different odd setting or normal. If you want to save that, you just go here, new tool preset, give it a name. Do not include the color because it will go back to your last used color, and then it isn't as effective to use over and over unless you like to always paint red. Give it a name and say OK, and it will add it to your preset list. If you want to get rid of it, just hit the trash can. If there's a lot of them that you want to edit, go to the preset manager, and you can do bunches of them here and delete them, etc. Okay, so I'm done with that. Let's delete that one. Yes, gone. All right, I hope you've enjoyed it.